Welcome, everyone, to the Surfing Historian. I'm your host, Jason Old, historian, surfer, and world traveler. This podcast is dedicated to highlighting some of the latest scholarly research in humanities, social sciences, and surf studies. So paddle out with us while we glide through the world of academia. Joining me today from California is conservationist Michael Blum. Michael's the director of Sea of Clouds, an organization dedicated to protecting America's important coastal places. While spending nearly his entire life near a coast, he came to conservation and historic preservation somewhat recently. Previously, he studied how pelican pouches inflate underwater. The first time Michael went to Malibu, he didn't even go surfing. He's since corrected that. But most recently, he's also served as president of Malibu Surfing Association, one of California's first surfing clubs. For today's episode, we'll be discussing his recent article he co-authored with Mike Orbach on protecting California surf breaks, Maritime Heritage, and Malibu Historic District. I'm super stoked to get you on the show, but before we get started, I'd like to take a moment to thank you and our listeners for being part of this episode of the Surfing Historian.
Jason, it's nice to be with you. Thanks for the invitation to come and talk about this paper that I did with my colleague, Mike Orbach, from our time together at Duke. The idea of protecting surf breaks confronts three questions, only two of which we addressed in the paper. The questions are, should we protect surf breaks? Could we protect them? And if so, how would it be done? Now, our paper doesn't really focus on the should we. We've kind of answered that question for ourselves, but really settles on and tries to address the could we and how would we. By could we mean, what are the requirements that could achieve some level of protection of a surf break? For us, it was that protection needed to be site-specific, connected to that particular surf break or surfing area, and that it would deliver a legally binding definition and some real level of protection, even if those protections were incomplete. And then the how would we? While new legislation is always an option to remedy a policy challenge, we wanted to work with existing policies, things that were already on the books, to see how we might be able to achieve these conservation outcomes. We made two big decisions. One was to focus on the iconic surfing area of Malibu in Los Angeles County. And on the other decision was to use the primary tool or a signature tool of American historic preservation, the National Register of Historic Places, to look at and examine historical and cultural significance of surfing at Malibu. We were able to successfully list Malibu, registered as the Malibu Historic District, on the National Register of Historic Places for its contributions to surfing. This is a little bit unique, but not restricted by the bounds of what the National Register is, more so by our familiarity with it. And through the listing on the National Register comes this legally binding definition, as well as some limited protections in coastal planning. Our paper then describes both the process and the product of this initiative and how it might serve us in the future as we think about sites of coastal recreation, like surf breaks, but more generally, places in which we are and have been created histories of settlement, of recreation, of history, culture, tradition, contest, and how those have played out for different communities to tell a richer and more inclusive story of our coastal history in California specifically, for this paper, but also more generally for the United States as a whole.
Yeah, I think this is amazing work that you're doing. And, obviously, I really enjoyed reading your article as well. I have a few questions for you. We talk about surf breaks and surfing areas You say they exemplify the human dimensions of coastal ecosystems, places connecting people and nature, and from which history, culture, tradition, economic activity, and even political conflict emerge. You also, just in talking and then in your article, talk about how people are connected to places. And of course, the Malibu Historic District, as you guys say, legitimizes a conservation approach that considers California surf breaks as natural sites subject to cultural and historic analysis. It recognizes connections to landscapes and seascapes in human coastal history and affirms the potential of historic preservation to consider sites possessing both environmental and cultural attributes. So, and obviously we've talked about, Malibu as a historic district and being on the first of its kind to be on the National Register, which is absolutely amazing. And so my question is in what way, given what I was just talking about from your article, in what way does Malibu fall within this example?
Yeah, it's a great question, and thank you for that. A National Register project tries to resolve three questions about a potential historic resource. What is its history? What is its historical significance is one question. The second is, what is its historical context? And the third is, what is its historic integrity? So your question is really about what is the significance of Malibu? How is it important to the broad history of California, of Southern California, and America as a whole, for that matter? And I should say that there are a number of histories that could be approached for Malibu. It was part of the ancestral lands of the Chumash. The Malibu village was a primary site in the southern portion of the Chumash territory. And Malibu was one of the last intact Spanish land grants. Through the early 1900s, one family owned all of the property in Malibu under that land grant. Now, within surfing, others have covered Malibu surfing more completely and thoughtfully than we have in our paper. So I'll refer you to Matt Warshaw's Encyclopedia of Surfing as one great example, covering some of the people, the broad history of Malibu and Malibu surfing. And Ben Marcus is another, in a book that he wrote about surfboards, and also through his articles in the Surfer's Journal. He's done some excellent work covering both with breadth and in depth subjects that are important for Malibu surfing history. But quickly, for our conversation, Malibu was first surfed in the late 1920s when the beach was still all private property. It became a prominent reference point through the 1960s, so-called the golden age of longboarding. It was a point of departure, or really a lost Eden, from which people reacted to and went abroad in their surf travels and surf explorations through the 1970s. And it was one of the origin sites for the rebirth of longboarding in the 1990s. Now, our paper doesn't cover this history. We focus in on a slice of Malibu surfing history spanning the 15 years following the end of World War II. And Malibu makes three important contributions to the sport in this period. First is a reimagination of surfboard design and performance. Malibu is that evolutionary link between plank boards and paddle boards on one hand, before Malibu surfing, and the refined longboards leading to the shortboard revolution afterward. A group of shapers at Malibu undertook a program which did several different things. They adapted hydrodynamic theory to surfboard design. They responded to the high-level hot dog performance surfing that they saw on a trip to Hawaii. They were among the first to develop and incorporate rocker into surfboard design, and among the first civilians to acquire and use fiberglass, resin, and foam as building materials from which to construct surfboards. In perspective, they made surfboards lighter, stronger, faster, shorter, more maneuverable, faster and less expensive to produce. The second contribution was the group of surfers who used these boards on the long and well-shaped waves of Malibu. They developed a relaxed or a cool style of surfing, which Malibu surfers came to embody. They drew new lines on waves, in short, accessing the face more quickly than other boards were able to, and being able to carve from top to bottom and back to top. And it's these surfers who would later move to Hawaii and have big wave careers of their own. They also included an important group of women surfers and included Los Angeles' first noted surfer of African-American descent. And the third contribution is probably the one which we're most familiar with. It's the youthful, bohemian, really white face of surfing, a cultural template that was closely identified with California, with surfing itself, and then packaged and sold to the rest of the world, mainly through the stories of a spirited teenage girl who traded sandwiches for surf lessons. This is Gidget. And Malibu is the beach of Gidget. A quote that I sometimes refer to is that Surfer magazine editor, one of the many, I guess, Sam George, said that Gidget, and I'm quoting, marked one of the most definitive epochs in surfing history. There was surfing before Gidget and really surfing after Gidget. In the late 1950s, it was estimated that there were only 5,000 surfers in California in the late 1950s again. And by 1962, following Gidget, first the book in 57 and the movie in 59, that number had grown to over 100,000 surfers. So that's the history that we write about. That's where we feel that Malibu made signal and important contributions to the culture and the history of the sport, and really gave a template for what would come next.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. And you mentioned Gidget, and you also mentioned that there were women surfers that emerged at this time, sort of as Malibu began to evolve as you might even call it like a surf mecca of sorts, with all of these new technologies and this explosion in surfing, as you said, sort of in the post World War II age. Of course, a lot of the technology that went into surfing, as you said, was spurred on by wartime technology. And so, of course, making surfboards much smaller and more manageable for women. Not that they couldn't lug around the bigger boards, of course, but it made it more manageable, not only for surfers in general, but of course it did make it more accessible for women. And then it made, the carving style that we all think of when we think of surfing, it made it possible, right? And so, but I actually want to ask you a little bit more about some of these women surfers, because, I think it's important to note, how women were participating in the sport at this time, because, as surfing was appropriated by, say, Americans from the Hawaiian Islanders, which did have a history of women surfers of significance, actually. And so, but when it was appropriated and brought, say, to the United States, it took on a more white male masculine sort of character, if you will. And so my question is, apart from Gidget, or along with Gidget, probably is a better way to phrase this, how did more women begin to emerge or get involved with the sport at this time? And so, was it because of the success of Gidget, or were there other examples alongside Gidget?
I think it was both. There were certainly a group of pre-Gidget surfers present, women surfers at Malibu. Some of these were the girlfriends of the male surfers that were there, and they wanted to surf themselves and not just stay on the beach. Some of them were the younger sisters of some of the surfers that were there and saw what their older brothers were doing and wanted to get into the sport. However they got there, they were there, and they were allowed, isn't the right word to say it, isn't the right way to say it, but they were given access, right, to waves and to surfboards, and to have some of these prominent surfboard shapers who were working at Malibu shape surfboards specifically for them. As one of the reasons that length dropped and weight dropped was to make surfboards accessible for these young women. And through that, saw their improved performance on these boards. And then they were kind of reappropriated or reincorporated into the designs for the men. And so They provided both a kind of a new set of requirements determined for their surfboards, which then revealed a new set of performance opportunities, which were, worked through in a number of further iterations, in interesting ways. Post Gidget, as I said, that explosive growth from 5,000 to 100,000 surfers in the course of in under 10 years, certainly included women, but portrayals in the media, portrayals in film and television and news reports at the time sort of immediately reasserted the male look and priority of surfing and put women, unfortunately, kind of back on the beach in bikinis, which was and is something that generations of women surfers have to struggle against.
Yeah, you're exactly right. Women have certainly been objectified within the sport of surfing and continue to be objectified, whether it's in marketing or anything related to the sport. Like you said, they were effectively put back on the beach in bikinis as opposed to being the participants that they were with people such as Gidget and others. And I do believe it is changing, and women are beginning to have a place. They deserve a place, and are beginning to assert themselves in ways to show that they belong in the water alongside their male counterparts. And so, there's really a lot of amazing scholarship coming out, about what we might even call surf feminism or sexism within surfing. I know someone who's coming on the show in a couple episodes, Scott Latterman. He's working on an article about sexism in surfing culture, and so it's really something that we as scholars are taking seriously, and highlighting the objectification of women within the sport, but also the positive strides that women are making, and their accomplishments as well. And so viewing surfing through a gendered lens is helping to expose some of the things that you just talked about. And I really enjoy reading folks, for example, Krista Comer, who has written a wonderful book, Surfing Girls in the New World Order. And it's certainly worth a read. It highlights, what she refers to as surf feminism. And there's, friends of mine on the other side of the planet in the land down under, Rebecca Olive, who also does work on surf feminism. So, you raise a great point about that. And, it's also nice to see women reasserting themselves and really doing extremely well in the sport. And so that's a positive step, in my opinion, at least for the surfing community.
I think you're exactly right, and I think it's also a way to illuminate and celebrate and hopefully recover some of the stories of these early women surfers. Again, early meaning pre-Gidget, as a new set of reference points and a new set of inspirations. Gidget is an inspiration, but some of these women who surfed on the beach before her were also inspirations. And it's also to recall and recover some of their stories and contributions to the sport as well.
Absolutely. And, I really, like I said, I appreciate you highlighting, the accomplishments of those women. And I'm really looking forward to reading some of the scholars that I mentioned, Latterman's piece that hopefully will be out sooner than later. And of course, having read Krista Comer's work, and Rebecca Olive's work, it's inspiring. And it really shows that women deserve and should have a place in the lineup. There's no doubt about it. And so, but I want to transition away from that because at the top of the show, you said there was three questions you were after in terms of protecting surf breaks, or at least in the case of Malibu, which we could expand out to other breaks, obviously. Should we, could we, and how can it be done? And I think you elaborated on could we and how can we, or how can it be done? But my question for you is, and I know you've touched on it a little bit, but should we? You made a compelling argument for could we and how can it be done? And you even broke down the history of the place, itself, the historic Malibu, from the indigenous history with the Chumash people all the way through, we'll say contemporary Malibu. And but my question is not only should we, but why should we? Why should we protect these surf breaks? Is it just about surfing, or is there a broader reason for protecting these places?
Yeah, a great question, a deep question, and one that we don't go into in the paper, although I think we both share some pretty strong commitments to that answer. So, let me make my commitments clear. Yes, we should. And for two different reasons, really operating at different scales. One is within the narrow slice of surfing. As much as I love surfing, as much as you love surfing, and the people listening to this podcast do as well, that's a pretty narrow slice of the pie. We have to admit, it's protecting surf breaks serves our interests quite well. And but I also think that there's a rationale and a case for why those places need to be protected. And as we were describing before, people interact with natural environments in a number of different ways, and through that set of interactions have created these important places, whether they're along the coast and represented in places such as surf breaks or other landscapes as well. It's that interaction and the results of that interaction which delivers or constructs place as holding important values and embodies importance to a community. And once a place has been able to secure that meaning, in my mind, it's worthy of considering it being protected. Here again, we're talking about surf breaks as recreational landscapes, and whether you want to say I want to save all recreation spots, good. If you want to say I want to save all or protect all surfing spots, good too. I want to protect places within my community that have direct economic impact, positive economic impact on my community, good as well. There's research showing that surf breaks and surfing areas deliver all of those kinds of benefits to communities. And that itself, I think, is a reason to protect them. But I also think that there's signals and proxies for other kinds of coastal landscapes. And this is the other reason for protecting them. Saying that you want to protect a surf break and saying that you can, and here's a way to protect a surf break, I think broadens the lens a little bit to say there might be other coastal places that have secured the same kinds of community meaning, maybe through different pathways, maybe for different reasons, because the places represent not a recreational spot like a high-level surf break like Malibu, but for different reasons. And then it begins asking a set of questions around, well, should these places be protected as well? Could they be, and how would they be? The same three questions that we started the conversation with.
Yeah, Michael, I'm glad you mentioned the value of these breaks as well. Can't remember exactly what episode. I think it's episode 9 or 10 that we have slated for Dr. Javier Leon and Dr. Ana Manero. They're actually doing an economic valuation of the Noosa World Surfing Reserve. And so they're actually applying an economic or doing an analysis of the surfing reserve to show the value of it economically in terms of, economic value, right? And so I guess that's somewhat self-explanatory. So I look forward to talking with them more about this as well, because these spaces, of course, they come with, I don't want to go off on a tangent about the negative, right? Obviously, overcrowding and things like that sort of go without saying. And I don't know that many surfers, if any, are get stoked on overcrowding. And so, but there are certain economic benefits to these surf zones, right? And that's what, like I said, Javier and Anna look at, and I'm really stoked to sort of see what their research has shown. Of course, Noosa being over in Australia, but as you said, you can apply this framework, the economic framework, or the cultural value, or the historic value, and as you have to Malibu. And so, I think it's certainly worth doing, and I really applaud you all for what you are doing to protect this surf space and the area more broadly. I do have a question for you though, because this is something you put in your article that you say, we agree with Reblick, and I hope I pronounced that name right, who suggests a project such as the Malibu Historic District by itself represents incomplete surf break protection, as it neither completely accounts for the larger marine biophysical features, for example, swell corridors, which influence surf breaks, to which we would add analogous terrestrial features such as watersheds, for example, nor access. And so, in other words, I don't know that I read that. I tried to summarize that, but yeah, in other words, you all are saying that this whole effort that you guys are working on still is incomplete. And so I guess my question for you is, what does that mean, and at what point would you effectively define it as complete?
So to say that you're interested in protecting surf breaks asks a question, what needs to be protected to protect a surf break? Now that certainly we would agree. So there are some things that we agree on, then there might be some room for debate on some others. We certainly mean that protecting the immediate coastal area where surfing takes place is part of surf break protection. And by and large, that's what the Malibu Historic District covered in terms of a geographic area. It goes out 500 meters into the near shore. It covers the beaches. It goes from one end of the beach to the other. It incorporates or includes the three primary surf breaks where surfing occurs at Malibu: first, second, and third point surf breaks. But to say that you're interested in surf break protection doesn't require you to think of larger geographic areas. We agree with others. Jesse is one who suggests that indeed, to protect surf breaks, you do need to consider these larger geographic areas. So for instance, most of the waves that come in at Malibu are either generated from hurricane activities spinning off of the coast of Mexico, or storm systems that are spinning off Australia and Antarctica and traveling the thousands of kilometers across the Pacific Basin into California. A swell corridor is that directional geographic area through which wave energy approaches the specific surf break. And Jesse's contention, and it's one that we're sympathetic to, is that surf break protection must include clear areas through which that wave energy can pass. Now, for a place like Malibu, and to which we were expanding on his critique, is that Malibu as a point break wave is nourished by Malibu Creek, the sediments coming through Malibu Creek, the cobbles and the sand, and other sediments. A creek that drains the second largest watershed in all of Los Angeles County. So, if you're thinking about swell corridors going into the ocean, isn't it also appropriate, and we think it is, that protections to protect a surf break must also include some of these land-based areas as well? Well, that's a pretty big geographic area, and indeed it is. I mean, that's one of the things that we enjoy so much about surfing, is that you're interacting with this collision of so many large geographic forces focused on this very specific area. But that's tough, right? That's tough from a policy perspective. There aren't many instruments that we're aware of in American coastal policy that can cover and span such large geographic areas. So it's unfinished work, it's imperfect work, but it's work that we think is that should get started. We think that Malibu, I deeply appreciate the compliment by highlighting that Malibu is the first surf break protected in this way, but it's also it's really the only surf break in the continental United States protected in this way. Not to say that Malibu is the only surf break that could clear this bar. It's really to say we have a lot of work still to do, and there's a time pressure in which to complete it. So imperfect as it is, incomplete as it is, while we wait for other policy solutions that might give us an opportunity to think about these ocean-based and land-based spaces in new ways and protections that might derive from them, let's work with what we have now, and as we push on those boundaries even farther or further.
Yeah, it makes sense. And you mentioned you said Jesse. You're referring to Jesse Reblick, and of course, correct me if I'm mispronouncing his last name. But he works in climate change law, coastal marine law, energy and environmental law, maritime law, and wetlands. And so, so I just wanted to clarify that for the listener. And I know that you actually had at one point you were the president of the Malibu Surfing Association. And my question is, in your time in that role, were you able to leverage this position to effectively bring about any policy change, or was it during this time that you began to craft up these policies? Like, what, in other words, how did your role as president tie into this effort to preserve the historic Malibu?
Looking back into that period of time, I think there were three inspirations which ultimately revealed themselves in this work to list Malibu on the National Register. The first was a controversy over a proposed toll road in San Diego County at Trussell's and San Onofre. This is the 241 toll road, and which would, among other things, directly affect the surf breaks at Trussell's and San Onofre. It went through the proposed toll road was aligned through a state park where a number of important listed, threatened, and endangered species are listed, through an important Native American ceremonial site, and just the audacity of that proposal, the specific alignment through all of those cultural, recreational, and natural resources, was something that had a big effect. If it could happen at Trussell's, what would that portend for all different kinds of surf breaks in California? The second was something that happened away from the beach, and this was the iconic camping spot, Camp 4 in Yosemite Valley, part of Yosemite National Park, was threatened by really the National Park Service, who wanted to relocate and build new employee housing over this iconic spot, which was the gathering location for elite level climbers during the golden age of climbing and now into the present. And it was really the work of one activist, one of the golden age climbers himself, who said, "This can't stand and I won't abide this," and developed, with help from some others, a proposal to list Camp 4 on the National Register for its contributions to the growth of climbing. This was a gathering spot. It wasn't important because there's great architecture in the camp spot. It wasn't important because of its views of Yosemite Valley. It was important because people gathered there, climbers gathered there to talk about climbing, their philosophies of climbing, and help develop some of the new equipment that would be used on Yosemite's granite walls. Well, that sounds like a lot like a surf break, right? A communal gathering spot where stories are told, ideas are developed, and it's known as much for its recreation and its importance to the community as it is for, other attributes that it might have. And so that was also an important reference point. The third was the listing of Malibu as the first World Surfing Reserve as part of the World Surfing Reserve program. That was also an important reference point, both because of what it accomplished, but also what it didn't accomplish, and felt like there was quite a bit of work unfinished from that designation, and what would be the next step from a non-binding honorary designation like a World Surfing Reserve would be something that actually had a legally binding definition and accorded some protection because of that definition. And in that ultimately, those three events and projects and work of a number of important people doing important work is, I think, what more than anything led me to the work that we're describing in this paper.
Yeah, as you said, this framework goes beyond, surfing and surf breaks, or really sort of the impetus behind, according to what you're saying, some of the impetus behind your motivations were actually spurred on by the efforts of climbers at Yosemite, and I'm glad you shared that with us because that's, I really like how you drew that connection and saw how that framework could be applied to surf spaces as well, because I think you're exactly right. And I'm not a big climber, but, when I think of, climbers sitting around and talking about equipment and ideas and the next place to climb. And yeah, I mean, that is for all intents and purposes for the climbers themselves, a sacred space. And so I can certainly see how they felt compelled to protect it, and for good reason. And so I really appreciate how you drew that connection between something beyond surfing and beyond surf spaces to show that this is a framework that can be used to protect spaces for a whole host of different reasons, above and beyond surfing, like you said. And so having said that, would you mind, you've mentioned these people doing extraordinary work and different things like that. So before I segue into some of your other research that you did prior to this, would you mind highlighting some organizations that you feel that, we as listeners could look into more or support that are doing a lot of this amazing work that you're talking about?
Within the surfing community, there isn't a more important organization protecting the interests of surfers and the way in which surfers look at coastal environments more than Surfrider Foundation and the local and the chapter network that they support. Certainly, and rightly so, they take sometimes controversial stances on coastal issues, but good for them for doing so. I also continue to appreciate the collegial relationship and the longtime support of the folks at Save the Waves Coalition who do similar work using kind of different strategies with different local capacities, but really focus internationally. The work that you've cited at NUSA and the Surfonomics report that will soon be coming out is really based on longstanding commitments that Save the Waves has, not only to the World Surfing Reserve program generally, but their work to bring a World Surfing Reserve designation to NUSA, and with it some other commitments to further protection of that really important surf spot in Australia. So I want to highlight their work as well.
Yeah, I want to second those organizations, Surfrider Foundation and Save the Waves Coalition. I'm impressed with all they've been doing and around the world. And so, yeah, I would agree that those are certainly worth highlighting. The efforts of those organizations are, like I said, I'd like to second that and recommend that our listeners take a look at what they're doing. I know that you didn't mention this, but I mentioned it in the intro, but Sea of Clouds, you're a director of that. And it's an organization dedicated to protecting America's important coastal places. So I thought I would just sort of put that plug in for you. And since clearly you weren't going to self-promote, so allow me to do that for you. And, segueing away from surfing, since I am starting to talk about you a bit more, you had a bit of an evolution in terms of how you got to where you are. You studied pelican pouches, and that was what you were doing as far as your graduate research. And so, but before you go into what your specific research was, which I do find absolutely fascinating, by the way, because personally being out, surfing, for example, in Nicaragua and other places at sunset and just seeing the pelicans come by or dive bomb into the water to catch food, I'm always sort of blown away with how majestic and beautiful they are. And, but hopefully you're going to tell me what's going on under the water when they, hit the water and go after their food. But like I said, before you go into that, can you talk a bit more about your evolution as a researcher, I guess from pelicans to surf breaks, because they really do both include the surf ecosystem, right? So you sort of transition from pelicans to surfers in a sense. So could you sort of elaborate more on that evolution?
I appreciate the question. It's just someplace that I've always found myself at home and the place that I've been comfortable with. I was very fortunate to grow up by the coast with a family who you could never have enough sand in the car. And mom and dad shuttling me to the beach and for surfing, and had a great group of friends when I was old enough to start driving myself to go surfing and on long surfing trips. So it was the point of reference for me. You were mentioning that you're not much of a climber. I'm even less so. I'm afraid of heights. So, the beach being at sea level seemed very natural and easy for me. And I don't know if it's an evolution as much of a continuation of looking around in a place that I'm very comfortable with and seeing what I see and trying to do what I do and finding ways to stay attached to those places and spaces as much as possible.
Yeah, no, I'm right there with you. I'm really just drawn to the beach as this, it's a magical space for so many reasons. And so I completely I can relate to that. And, but I would like for you to share a bit more about your research specifically with pelicans. And it's my understanding that your grad research focused on pelican pouches. Can you explain to us what that even means and what your research was about?
I was interested in a way of thinking about biology in which you look at the natural world trying to make its way in the physical world, being constrained and given opportunities by the laws of physics. This field, comparative biomechanics, really captured my attention and led me off on a journey into graduate school. And it was my project in graduate school, as you said, was to look at how a pelican inflated its pouch underneath the water. So as a quick background, the brown pelican that you see on the coasts of the New World are large birds, but rather small pelicans. And among the 7 species of pelicans distributed worldwide, brown pelicans are the only pelican species that has this dramatic feeding behavior in which they'll dive headfirst into the water in search of food. And as dramatic as that sounds about what's happening above the water, underneath the water is as much or even more so. The bones in the lower beak bend dramatically outwards. They're rigid, but also flexible. And the pouch that you're talking about, that big throat pouch, expands as the bones bend and it opens its mouth in search of food. And so it was my idea that the pouch was actually trying to do 2 things for pelicans at once. One was it was acting as a sort of underwater parachute, that by inflating, it would also slow the bird down, allowing it to feed in shallow water. In air, a parachute inflates to dramatically slow the speed of a payload. And underwater, the pouch would inflate to dramatically slow the speed of a pelican. Now, that's all fine and good, but the object of this feeding behavior is to feed. And so the pouch was also acting as a fishing net, that in this volume of water that is contained within the pouch, hopefully there would be a fish or fishes as well. The pelican completes this inflation step passively. It's, as far as we understand, it's not actively inflating. It actively opens its mouth, but everything else is happening because it's slamming headfirst into this big volume of water. It pops back up to the surface. It lowers its head where it quickly snaps its beak shut and slowly drains the water. And hopefully a fish remains in the pouch where it throws its head back and swallows the fish. Pelicans can do this, as you've seen, repeatedly throughout the day. And also in bouts with other pelicans as they come upon small schools of fish. And, I just thought it was tremendously interesting and exciting. As it turns out, I was a pretty good student, but a pretty bad biologist. And so I didn't complete that program and that field of study. Interestingly enough, another researcher a couple of years after I completed my work found a connection between this inflation behavior that I was describing and the inflation of baleen whales and the throat pouch, essentially, that they inflate as they feed on small crustaceans. And that's really a special sauce of biology, that if you can find independent lineages converging on a similar solution to a physical problem, that's really speaking to something special that's happening. Birds on one hand, marine mammals on the other, doing something very similar. And as he was able to demonstrate, under some similar mechanical designs about how pelican pouches on one hand are designed and how the throat blubber and the feeding system of baleen whales are designed on another. So, some really nice work on his part.
Yeah, surfing all the time. And like I said, in Nicaragua, I have the good fortune of watching them fly by. I mean, I'm convinced they're surfing actually, because they get so close to the waves and they stay right in the pocket a lot of times. So they're really good air surfers, you might even say. And so, but thanks for sharing that other research as well. You said another individual sort of made this connection between whales and these pelicans. But, as far as your evolution, to be honest with you, this passion you have for the sea and sea life really seems to have brought you to where you are now, to protecting these places. And, so I know you may not see this connection, but I think there's a connection between, your research with these pelicans and your evolution as a scholar now protecting surf ecosystems. And so, to be honest, it seems that surfers and pelicans now are both beneficiaries of your work. So, I want to commend you for all you've done and this path you've walked in terms of your passions for pelicans and now your passion for protecting not only pelicans but surf breaks and surf ecosystems more broadly. And so Michael, I just want to also thank you for taking the time for being on the podcast. And with that, I do want to go ahead and give you the last word.
Well, this has been a lot of fun to talk with you. I really appreciate the opportunity. I haven't talked about pelicans in a really long time, so I appreciate being connected to that part of my own journey, but also, to these amazing animals as well. I think I'll end with 4 takeaways. 1, surfing areas are natural sites and can be subject to cultural analysis. 2, focusing on surfing's cultural heritage is a valid conservation pathway and also a possibility for future surf break protection efforts. 3, the tool that we used in this paper, historic preservation, can achieve coastal conservation objectives. And 4, this Malibu Historic District project establishes a process and a precedent for protecting other surfers in the United States. And I think those are the 4 takeaways that I'd like to share with you.
If you enjoyed this episode with conservationist Michael Blum, I'd like to invite you to check out my next episode when I'm joined by fellow surf historian Dr. Scott Latterman. Scott's a specialist in modern United States history, and his work broadly explores the various ways that Americans have encountered and ascribed meaning to the rest of the world. For our episode, we'll be discussing his book, Empire and Waves, as well as a recent article he's working on related to sexism and surfing culture. This is an episode you won't want to miss. This has been another episode of The Surfing Historian. I'm your host, Jason Old. Be sure to share, like, and subscribe to never miss an episode. Again, thanks for listening, and until next time, stay stoked.